Welcome to the Flying Cat Academy Dyslexia Reading Specialist Training Program. My name is Shauna Odette and I'm your instructor. This is lesson 2 in the What is Dyslexia unit, and our lesson for today is called Defining Dyslexia. You can take out your thinking paper that I've provided for you, and you can use this as a place to organize your notes as you watch and you listen to this lesson. Let's get started. Before I became a reading specialist, I had some beliefs about what it means to be dyslexic. And these were not fact-based beliefs. They came from my own lived experience with my son, who is a dyslexic person. In kindergarten, there were no red flags from the school that there might be a problem. But in grade 1, the teacher said, he's reversing a lot of letters and he's not coming to reading as I would expect him to. But then she reassured me by saying, oh, but don't worry, he's so bright, I'm sure it'll all work itself out. But that was my first, danger sign, and I started looking for clues as to what might be going on. And in grade 2, the problem persisted, and the gap between my son and the rest of the kids in the class got larger. And then his teacher that year said, there really is a problem. So what I was noticing as I was looking around at his friends that also had similar reading problems were that there were more boys than girls that seemed to have trouble coming to reading. So I thought that might be something. My son had trouble learning to tie his shoes, so I thought, is that an indicator of dyslexia? I'm left-handed, so I worried that maybe that was something that maybe I had passed to him because I'm left-handed, who knows? And the letter reversals I thought were a definite sign of dyslexia. He reversed so many letters when he wrote. I knew that dyslexia at its heart was an impairment of someone to be able to learn to read and write, but that was as far as my definition went. Let's take a moment now so that you can look at your long-held beliefs about dyslexia. So at this moment, before you've had the whole course, what do you think dyslexia is? What would you write as a definition? On your thinking paper, you can take a moment and do so. And then in the next column called identifiers, what do you think are the clues, those little red flags that you see in your classroom that tell you, this person might have trouble, this person might be dyslexic? It's okay if they're wrong. Later on, we'll separate fact from fiction in this lesson. Let's get writing. Now let's get our facts straight. And if we want to do that, the best place to go, I believe, is Sally Shea. She is an American physician and scientist, and she's a professor in learning development at Yale University. She's also the founder of the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. And there's a pile of research that comes from Sally Shea that has informed us and has provided us a framework for our modern understanding of dyslexia. So I can't understate this woman's importance in the field. Sally Shea, in her book Overcoming Dyslexia, which you can get from our local library, says people with dyslexia have trouble matching letters that they see on the page with sounds, the sounds of those letters, and the combinations of letters that they make. When they have trouble with that step, all the other steps are harder. So what she's saying, if you remember that reading pyramid from our last lesson, is that people with dyslexia have trouble with phonemic awareness, matching the symbol to the sound. This is really important because the sound is going into their ears correctly, and then there's a twist that happens in the brain. So this is not a problem with vision. This is not a problem with hearing. This is a brain-based learning difference. Dyslexic children and adults struggle to read fluently, spell words correctly, and learn a second language, among other challenges. But these difficulties have no connection to their overall intelligence. In fact, Dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty in reading in an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. While people with dyslexia are slow readers, they often paradoxically are very fast and creative thinkers with strong reasoning abilities. And given a proper reading intervention, my son actually is quite a fast reader now. Dyslexia is also very common, affecting 20% of the population. In our last lesson, we learned that was between 15 and 20% of the population, and representing between 80 and 90% of all those with learning disabilities. Scientific research shows differences in brain connectivity between dyslexic and typical reading children, providing a neurological basis for why reading fluently is a struggle for those with dyslexia. And this goes back to yesterday's lesson as well, where we were talking about the different brain circuits. So all children begin to learn with that upper brain circuit, but then children with the correct wiring will switch to the lower brain circuit very quickly, which is much faster. And they're fluent readers by the end of grade 2. Whereas dyslexic people who have a weak lower circuit stay reading with the upper circuit, where they're sounding out each grapheme, each letter, k, a, t. They don't have that visual picture of CAT, and so that's an indication that they're not using that circuit. Now let's look at a different definition. This is one that comes from the International Dyslexia Association. In their definition, they tell us that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It's interesting that the first sentence stresses that this is a brain-based learning disorder. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So decoding is another word for reading. So you have poor spelling and poor reading. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So this is the idea that Sally was getting at, which is that this is a person who is unexpected in their difficulty coming to learn to read and write because they have average intelligence. And the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And if we go back to our reading pyramid that we saw in the last lesson, we remember that comprehension and vocabulary are both elements that are further up the reading pyramid. And you can't move up the pyramid until you solve the phonemic awareness problem, which is at the root of dyslexia. So you can't go forward, you can't move up until you have a strong base. And that's what we're aiming to do when we're rewiring the brain for reading by giving proper reading interventions and by teaching properly in K1 and 2. In the last row on your chart, it says etymology. And I thought this would be an interesting way to look at the definition as well. Let's just look at what the word means. So in 1885, the definition was a difficulty in reading due to a condition of the brain. So even when this condition was discovered, they realized this was a brain-based learning disorder. If we look at what the actual term means, dys, dys, comes from Greek, and it means bad or abnormal or difficult. And then lexis means word, which broadly means reading. So if we look at the two parts of that word, dys and lexia, we're talking about bad reading. We know that since 1885, doctors have suspected this was a brain-based learning difficulty. Sally Shea provided proof in her studies by having participants who were dyslexic and non-dyslexic undergo MRI brain scans to look at how their brains looked during reading. And she found that there were specific differences in the parts of the brain that were activated in non-impaired readers and dyslexic readers. A brain scan is a true identifier of dyslexia. Unfortunately, it's expensive and they're hard to get, so most dyslexic people will never have a brain scan to be identified in that way. If we could, though, we would see that effective readers are using 3 different parts of their brains. This occipitotemporal lobe is the one that I was talking about as calling the lower circuit, where you see the word as a whole image and you instantly know that those 3 letters, C-A-T, spell cat. People with dyslexia, they start by using their upper circuit, and then they switch to what you see in the picture, which is their Broca's area, and that's an effort to try and get some speed. So Broca's area does give dyslexic readers slightly more speed, but it is not nearly as effective, not nearly as fast as using that lower circuit. So with a reading intervention, we will change the way that the MRI picture will look, and you will not be able to tell the difference between a dyslexic reader and an effective reader because they will be activating the same parts of the brain that an effective reader would activate after a proper reading intervention. So I'm hoping that I'm underscoring the importance of the reading intervention, because if we don't give a timely reading intervention that's a proven, systematic, proper reading intervention, then we are dooming that dyslexic person forever to be not fluent. Fluency is speed and accuracy. And if we wait too long, they lose access to those different parts of their brain. So the wonderful news is that dyslexic brains can be rewired to read. But it doesn't happen on their own, and it doesn't happen if we wait too long. It happens through proper reading instruction in K1, 2, and 3, and it happens through proper reading interventions when they're needed. If a dyslexic person is given those proper reading interventions, then we can rewire their brain for reading and change their life. Understood.org is an excellent website for people who want to understand dyslexia and the brain. And in this video clip that you're about to watch, Guinevere Eden discusses the parts of the brain that are used for reading and how the dyslexic brain changes after a proper reading intervention is given. You can watch the video now. Enjoy.
We've known for some time what children with dyslexia look like in terms of their reading skills, skills in areas of language like rhyming and what's called phonemic awareness. But the brain research has really added to this by showing us what the brain looks like when people read and what the brain looks like when people with dyslexia read, and there are some differences. When we think about reading, we need to remember that we are really probing a person's ability to understand that words are made up of sounds and that those sounds have a representation in their written counterparts, in the letters. And this is where things can become very difficult for a child, understanding that a word that sounds just like one continuous sound, like cat or dog, is actually made up of 3 sounds that are joined together so seamlessly that you would hardly know that they are in fact 3 sounds, and because of that are represented by these 3 letters.
Key takeaway. Dyslexia involves trouble connecting the sounds that make up words with the letters that represent those sounds.
Something that many of us take for granted and forget is just how complicated reading is. There's nothing about our brain that was designed to learn to read. When our brains learn to read, we rearrange them quite significantly, and we draw on a range of skills that were designed to do other things. The same mechanisms that we use when we read, which is accessing the sound representation of language, that area in the brain is involved when we read. It's clearly become directed towards reading and not just spoken language. And it is integrated with areas in the back of the brain that help us recognize words that we then at some point begin to recognize by sight, because the oral part of language is important in helping us put the sound representation on words. But after we see a certain word a number of times, we don't necessarily have to sound it out every time, but we begin to move it to a part of the brain that helps us visually support recognizing a word by sight. The more we see those words, the less we have to actually sound those words out, but we recognize them almost like a picture. And it does seem that, in fact, the area in our brain that we use to see pictures in our visual environment becomes hijacked by reading. It literally, reading as it establishes in the brain, says, move over. Now I'm going to use this part of the brain to help us recognize word forms. And then we also have a part of the brain that helps us pronounce the word and pull out the right pronunciation, and that's in the front of the brain. So reading is made up of different components, and likewise what we see in the brain is a network that reflects those different components that we use for reading.
Key takeaway. Reading uses different parts of the brain to sound out unfamiliar words. Recognize familiar words by sight. Think about how to pronounce the words.
When we study children or adults with dyslexia, we find that some of those areas aren't activated quite the same as they are in people who do not have dyslexia. The imaging research has given us kind of a very nice inside view of the reading brain and how it differs in struggling readers. And it's also given us an opportunity to ask the question, what happens in children or adults who have had difficulties with reading when they're given some tutoring and they're given the skills that they need to sound out those words, to really apply the code to allow them to pronounce the words and get better and more fluent at doing that. The research shows that if you are very explicit in instructing children about the rules of phonics and understanding how language is structured and then how it relates to the written counterpart, and if you use methods that show children in a very structured way, in a very intensive way, how that works, that really is a key component to a successful intervention. And once you understand the relationship between sounds and letters and you can read, you then need some time to become a more fluid reader. Give your brain the time to not just increase the skills in phonological processing, but also now have the experience of encountering words again and again so that you can commit them to your visual word memory and have the practice and then go on to use that skill to derive meaning. What isn't considered an effective intervention are the kinds of things that focus on trying to train eye movement control, trying to change a child's ability to balance, and those kinds of things.
Key takeaway. Effective interventions for kids with dyslexia teach the relationship between sounds and letters in a very explicit and structured way. Help struggling readers recognize words they have seen before. Do not focus on things like balance or eye movement.
Really, at the heart of dyslexia is a difficulty in mapping language to print, and it's that skill that these interventions really address as a way to give the child the key that they need to access written language. And the imaging has shown us areas in the brain that now, after the intervention has occurred and after their reading has improved, areas that increase in brain activity and other areas that are compensating and helping out to make that person a better reader. And those kinds of insights tell us something about the mechanisms of reading and struggling readers, and perhaps why certain brain areas participate in the process of making a person a stronger reader. And that's where the neuroscience insight helps. The scientists can look at those brain changes and deduce from that, well, what are the areas in the brain that support that change? And why those areas? Is it the language areas in the left hemisphere that we use for language and reading? Or is it some other areas? And the researchers use that information to try and understand why those brain areas, why did they change, and what is it about their relationship to the intervention that makes this a good intervention.
Key takeaway. Researchers are using brain imaging to understand how structured literacy interventions help people with dyslexia.
One of the things that we're learning from brain imaging is how malleable the brain is in several different ways. So, for example, when we learn to read, our brain is changing quite dramatically through that process. People who become skilled readers differ from those who never learn to read in brain anatomy and brain function. So reading itself is a process that changes the brain. And then the other thing we can do is ask questions about, well, what about children who are struggling readers and adults who are struggling readers? Maybe as an adult you would think you can't make any more gains in reading, but in fact you can, and your brain is still changing in ways to support those skills to make you become a better reader.
Key takeaway: our brains are very changeable. Even adults with dyslexia can change their brains to become better readers.
And what we're also now beginning to see with brain imaging research is a focus on other skills that we have, skills that maybe even be enhanced in people with dyslexia. So now we see a sort of a new phase of research where people are beginning to ask questions like, why is it that we hear reports of people with dyslexia being better at seeing the big picture, maybe at being better at visuospatial skills, so working in a visual environment and being very good at pulling together a lot of visual information and seeing the big picture.
Key takeaway: researchers are beginning to study visual spatial skills and other strengths that may be linked to dyslexia.
If you translate that into a laboratory environment, you may test that by asking people to see images where your ability to detect differences really require you on taking in the big picture than rather than just focusing on a detail. And those have shown that people with dyslexia, when faced with that kind of a task, are better than those who do not have dyslexia. And now the question with the imaging is, how is that information processed in the brain, and how does it speak to the other differences that we see in those brains? Is there a trade-off? Does the dyslexia come with a heightened skill, or does the experience with dyslexia produce that heightened skill, and what does that look like in the brain?
Key takeaways: different parts of the brain are used to sound out unfamiliar words, recognize familiar words by sight, and pronounce the words. Effective reading interventions can change the brains of kids and adults who have dyslexia. Brain researchers are starting to study strengths that may be linked to dyslexia.
So we don't have access to the expensive MRI equipment that Sally Shea was able to use to determine who is dyslexic and who is not. So what can we do in our regular classroom to figure this out? Well, one thing is irregular words. And dyslexic students have great trouble with words that can't be sounded out. So you think about the sight words on the Dolch and the Fry list, and there's some words that are able to be sounded out on those lists, and we just have to learn them as sight words because they come up all the time. And then there's another subsection on that list where those words are truly irregular, and when you try to sound them out phonetically, it doesn't work. And this is what becomes very obvious with dyslexic brains. You can figure out who is and who isn't dyslexic. I put two videos on this slide, one of my son, and he was in grade 2 at this time, and he is a dyslexic person. And then there's another video of another grade 2 student reading the same list. And I thought it would be really valuable for you to hear these two different readers come to these lists and try and read them. And you'll see how my son labors over some of these words. So there's a great time lapse as he tries to sound them out. And then you'll hear the other brain, and you'll just hear the great difference between the impaired brain and the non-impaired brain.
Wheel. Ammo.
Okay.
Very. Word. Bus. Is there another way to say bus?
Okay.
Up. No.
Yeah.
anything. There. Cover.
Very good.
Wall. Giant.
That's right.
Giant.
Okay.
Giant? Giant?
Gentle.
So, now I'm here. Lab.
Good.
Ordinary.
Okay.
Grow. Oh. Sheep.
Okay.
Beast.
Okay.
No, I'm not guessing that. Bicep.
Okay.
E. Body.
Okay.
Bear. Does this make you sound?
You're doing a great job.
Because I'm getting mixed up with what you English.
That's okay. It's good. It doesn't matter. Sam, if you get one.
Soul.
Soul.
Good. I said soul, I said good.
Okay, that's pretty close.
Can we count it? That's good.
Oh, yeah.
Bicycle. Hood. Body.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's okay.
Tail. No, I'll. Head.
Okay.
Two.
You're almost done, baby.
Teeple.
Okay. What did you say?
Teeple. Topo. Eeple.
People.
Young. Quilt.
Good.
I kind of got that mixed up from fast,
That's okay.
but it worked.
Yeah, it worked.
How many did get one?
You
Yeah.
only have 4 left.
How many did I get one?
I don't know. I have to go over the video. I won't know until I do the video.
Something.
This one?
Yeah, I thought it was something, but probably not.
Okay, keep going.
No, I want it. It's probably wrong.
You want to make a guess?
Summer.
Okay.
No, I'm not guessing that.
Okay, well, let's look at the letters.
Something.
Okay.
Is that good?
Sure.
Did I get it right?
No, but it's okay. Come on, you only got three words left. Okay.
No, I'm not guessing.
You only got 3 words left. Did your timing's part of it too?
Fine.
You're doing fine. 2 words left. Come on, you got this.
Gluten. Is that gluten?
Okay.
Iron.
Iron. Get. That's okay. You don't have to get it.
Heat.
Great. What does it sound so girly?
Great.
Yeah, that's right.
We're good. How am I doing? Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. Blush, bus of anything, anything there. Cover will gently lamp, not lamp. Obby, yeah. Ground, shoe, biscuit, by bear, Sue, because hot, berry, tie, pad, people, young, court, through, tie, iron, great.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. The Core Phonics survey is another true identifier of someone who is a dyslexic person. I give this to every student that I work with, and we do it as the very first lesson. And this tells me what the student has mastered and where the gaps are. And as I'm doing the survey, I'm looking for certain types of mistakes that dyslexic brains tend to make. Consonant sound confusion, that's that confusion at the phonemic awareness level, is a true indicator. So maybe the student would see a B, and instead of saying B, they would say P. Vowel confusion is another one that's a true identifier, and I've never had a student who didn't have vowel confusion that worked with me. When I was getting my training at the Dyslexia Training Institute, all three of my professors said that that is a true indicator, and they've never had a person who is dyslexic that didn't have vowel confusion. Pseudo words are another thing that dyslexic brains truly struggle with, and pseudo words are nonsense words. They're made up words. So a dyslexic brain might have no trouble sounding out mat, but if you wrote it as zat, which isn't a word, then they wouldn't be able to do it. So that's something you look for. And then diphthongs and multi-syllable words would be unknown. So the diphthongs are they could be consonant diphthongs, and that's when two consonants go walking and make a brand new sound. So for example, PH is Greek, and it makes f, as in the letter F would do that. And that would be unknown to a dyslexic brain. And then the dyslexic brains have great trouble with multi-syllable words, because for a dyslexic brain, words are sticky and they don't see where the syllables are. And so they have no way to take apart the word, so they can't identify the different parts. And so they don't know which parts are diphthongs, which parts are blends, and the word just is unintelligible to them. A lot of times they'll look at the first letter and then make a wild guess at the word. Now let's go back to the part of the definition from the Dyslexia Association, where they said that dyslexia is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Sally Shea says this in a different way in her book. She says dyslexia would be when someone has a problem with reading and writing, and the problem persists over time, and the problem persists in spite of effective teaching. So if you have those three things in place and the person still has trouble, you're probably dealing with the dyslexic. The cognitive ability part is really nicely laid out on the slide here, because there's two pictures, and you can basically put the two people that have trouble reading into two categories. One is just your garden variety poor reader, and that's different than a dyslexic person. So you can see that their verbal ability, their nonverbal ability, their reading, their spelling, their phonological ability is all roughly in the same range when we're talking about someone who has the proper circuitry for reading, who just doesn't come to reading. And that's that 10% that we talked about in lesson 1. This is different than a person who has a dyslexic brain who has a weak lower circuit, because for them it's an unexpected disability that they would be not able to come to reading and writing properly, because they might have a very high verbal ability, as my son does. They might have a very high nonverbal ability. And so because of those strong standard scores, it is unexpected that they would have low reading and writing and reading, spelling, and phonological scores. So there's a difference, there's a discrepancy between what they're bringing to the table and what they're able to achieve. Now, genetics is a true identifier of dyslexia. So the question, does it run in your family, is relevant. We know that 25 to 50% of children who are dyslexic have a parent who is dyslexic. And we also know that if there's one child in a family who is dyslexic, it's most likely that 50% of their siblings are also dyslexic. There was a study done in 2002 that actually identifies some of the genes that are involved in dyslexia. So knowing that dyslexia is in your family is valuable information, and we'll consider it a true identifier. We want to solve reading difficulties in dyslexic people as early as possible, and for that reason, we want to know the red flags. One of the earliest signs of dyslexia is fuzzy phonemes, and you can see this as early as a 1 or 2 year old child. It's really important to know that 50% of the kids who end up going into kindergarten and getting speech help end up later on being diagnosed as dyslexic. So we're looking for, is the speech clear, or are those phonemes, those smallest units of sound in English, are they fuzzy? Another indicator that's a true identifier of a dyslexic brain, that is one that we can identify very early before they even get to kindergarten, is the phonological awareness skills. And the first one is, can a child rhyme? My child couldn't rhyme, so when he was really little, we'd be, out in the canoe with his friends, and we'd all be singing nursery rhymes. And my son wouldn't know the song. It wouldn't be obvious to him that the end of the line rhymed with the next end of the line. It was a skill he just didn't have. And had I known that that was a red flag, I might have caught the problem earlier. So rhyming is one that we can look for in the classroom. Can the student do it or not? At the start of this lesson, I told you that one of my beliefs before I became a reading specialist was that more boys were dyslexic than girls. And as it turns out, this one is not a true identifier. Studies, and you can see there were 4 of them that were done there, show that dyslexia affects boys and girls equally. Sally Shea maintains that boys are over-identified because they're more likely to act out in the classroom than the girls. And so that might make it more obvious that there's a problem. But in reality, it's a problem that affects boys and girls the same as far as percentage-wise. There's a common belief that dyslexics see letters reversed. As we've learned, this is not a problem of vision. This is a problem of not being able to attach the correct phoneme to the correct grapheme. So it's not a true identifier. Ironically, this is actually a belief that one of my son's teachers had, and it was the reason that she gave me a call and a heads up that there might be a problem with his reading. So even though it's not a true identifier, it helped me out because it told me that, hey, there's a problem. But this was proven as not to be a true identifier by a professor at the University of Albany. And he asked dyslexic and non-dyslexic American students to reproduce a series of symbols that they had never seen before. And it turned out that dyslexic students performed the task just as well and accurately as the non-dyslexic students, proving that eyesight is not a true identifier of dyslexia. And like there is, my son did reverse a lot of letters, and it's common for young kids to do so, whether they're dyslexic or non-dyslexic. And it's the idea that, you know, I'm still Shauna, whether I'm facing you forwards or facing you back. And that's what life teaches a child. But then when they come to reading, it's not the same, because if a letter is reversed, it actually means something different. So in the graphic at the bottom, a chair, whether it's standing this way or as it is in the second picture, is still a chair. We can put it upside down, it's still a chair. We can face it the other way upside down, and it's still a chair. But in reading, each of the symbols, when they're reversed, they mean something different, and that can confuse kids. Usually that confusion is sorted out by the end of grade 1, and if it continues past grade 2, then there's a sign that something's going on, but it's not an identifier of dyslexia. I wanted to give you a chance to hear from one of the greats herself, Sally Shea. And in this video clip, she is going to review some of the early signs of dyslexia. And she's going to underscore the importance of identifying these kids early so that we can solve the problem and so that we cannot doom them to forever be non-fluent.
My question, I think, was already been answered, but I'll ask Dr. Shea. The National Center for Learning Disabilities believes that all parents and professionals who work with young children should be informed of the early signs of dyslexia. I guess maybe you can focus on what families and doctors can identify and should be aware of that are early signs that maybe more people would recognize that they need to actually get their child or maybe their patient or their student further evaluation, rather than just saying, well, they'll improve, which is what we were kind of told. Well, it's early, she's only 6, you know, and we're like, no. All the other 6-year-olds are reading at a much higher level, and her brothers did, and we know that. So what should we be aware of? The early warning signs, what can we do?
Good question, and I'm so glad you asked it. Children can and must be identified, and the parents are the ones that know the child best. Sometimes schools don't listen to them, but parents do know the child best. So dyslexia is a language-based disability. So you can start right away. There may be a delay in talking. As children grow up and go into toddlerhood, and I think Ms. Santee mentioned it, one of the first things, dyslexia results from a difficulty getting to the individual sounds of spoken words. So children have to be able to separate out the sounds into each individual sound that represents the letter. So one of the first times the child has to do that is when they have to rhyme. Because how do you know cat match that rhyme? You know, you pull it apart and you look at the at. So children who have difficulties rhyming, then who have difficulties learning the sounds and the letters, that's initially. So that's something that parents can watch for, but also pediatricians. I am a pediatrician, and I must say pediatricians need to know more. They're really the people who are often the ones that follow the child, know the child, but they don't know enough about dyslexia. And we at the Yale Center are going to be taking actions to educate pediatricians, to involve them more. And we've now actually developed some instruments that can be used for screening at kindergarten and at first grade. So I've just begun what are the symptoms. I have them in my book, Overcoming Dyslexia, but they should be made part of teacher training. Every teacher shouldn't deny when a parent is concerned, but should actually know what dyslexia is, as Max said, knowing what it's about, and be able to identify that child, and have the support at the school to be able to do that. And that doesn't occur. I just want to add also that very often, and we've been talking about Charles Schwab and others, dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty, as I showed on the slides. You can have a high IQ and read much below that. And very often schools If you're bright, they say, oh, well, you know, as Max was told, you're not trying hard enough, or you have to work harder. So children and young adults who have high levels of intelligence, and that you can test for and must be tested for, shouldn't be overlooked as well.
Thank you
For that question.
You're welcome. And I just want to say it again, it's not, in my opinion, I've got 4 kids. Anyone who has children knows. We could tell when she was younger. And we were advocates because we had experience. I would implore everyone to, as a parent, to be an advocate. And the last thing, and then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman, is that anyone who had kids also know that when you're in kindergarten and first grade, the social status starts to develop of where you fit amongst your peers. It's very, very early. It's much earlier than that even. It's in So to wait it can do a lot of damage.
I just want to add that data hot off the presses and our laboratories show that that gap is there by first grade. And it's just not acceptable to want to wait and watch. That's waiting for failure. And just to reinforce what you say, children know who's in the Sparrows reading group and who's in the Eagles reading group.
They do.
And you can't fool them.
You can't.
So that early identification, that should be mandatory. The teachers have to look for the signs. Children need to be evaluated, and they can be, and then get the evidence-based instruction that they require, because you can turn an unhappy child into a happier one. But if you do it early, you don't have to go through that unhappiness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchan.
The following video clip is another great video about understanding dyslexia, and it comes from Professor Kelly Salmon Hurley, who was one of my professors at the Dyslexia Training Institute. Enjoy.
Take a moment to read the following. How was that? Frustrating? Slow? What were those sentences about? They're actually a simulation of the experience of dyslexia, designed to make you decode each word. Those with dyslexia experience that laborious pace every time they read. When most people think of dyslexia, they think of seeing letters and words backwards, like seeing B as D and vice versa. Or they might think people with dyslexia see saw as was. The truth is, people with dyslexia see things the same way as everyone else. Dyslexia is caused by a phonological processing problem, meaning people affected by it have trouble not with seeing language, but with manipulating it. For example, if you heard the word cat and then someone asked you, remove the C, what word would you have left? At. This can be difficult for those with dyslexia. Given a word in isolation like fantastic, students with dyslexia need to break the word into parts to read it. Fan, tas, tick. Time spent decoding makes it hard to keep up with peers and gain sufficient comprehension. Spelling words phonetically like S-T-I-K for stick and F-R-E-N-S for friends is also common. These difficulties are more widespread and varied than commonly imagined. Dyslexia affects up to 1 in 5 people. It occurs on a continuum. One person might have mild dyslexia, while the next person has a profound case of it. Dyslexia also runs in families. It's common to see one family member who has trouble spelling, while another family member has severe difficulty decoding even one-syllable words like catch. The continuum and distribution of dyslexia suggest a broader principle to bear in mind as we look at how the brains of those with dyslexia process language. Neurodiversity is the idea that because all our brains show differences in structure and function, we shouldn't be so quick to label every deviation from the norm as a pathological disorder, or dismiss people living with these variations as defective. People with neurobiological variations like dyslexia, including such creative and inventive individuals as Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, and Cher, clearly have every capacity to be brilliant and successful in life. So here's the special way the brains of those with dyslexia work. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is generally in charge of language and ultimately reading, while the right typically handles spatial activities. fMRI studies have found that the brains of those with dyslexia rely more on the right hemisphere and frontal lobe than the brains of those without it. This means when they read a word, it takes a longer trip through their brain and can get delayed in the frontal lobe. Because of this neurobiological glitch, they read with more difficulty. But those with dyslexia can physically change their brain and improve their reading. With an intensive multisensory intervention that breaks the language down and teaches the reader to decode based on syllable types and spelling rules, the brains of those with dyslexia begin using the left hemisphere more efficiently while reading, and their reading improves. The intervention works because it locates dyslexia appropriately, as a functional variation in the brain, which naturally shows all sorts of variations from one person to another. Neurodiversity emphasizes this spectrum of brain function in all humans and suggests that to better understand the perspectives of those around us, we should try to not only see the world through their eyes, but understand it through their brains.
We've come to the end of our lesson, so let's have a quick review. What is dyslexia? We know that it's a language-based disability, so it's going to affect a person's ability to learn to read, to learn to write. It may affect their spoken language. 50% of the kids that have speech problems who end up with the speech pathologist in kindergarten will later go on to be diagnosed as dyslexic. We know this is a brain-based learning disorder. We can see that through MRI research done by Sally Shea. It's a problem of matching the symbol, the letter, the grapheme, to the sound, which is called the phoneme. And it's a problem of matching sounds to letter symbols. One of those problems, matching the letter symbols to the sound, creates problems with reading, which means decoding. And there's an example on the page. The other one, matching the sounds to the letters, is encoding problems, and that's where spelling comes in. We know that there's about 20%, the number ranges from 15 to 20% of the population will be identified as dyslexic. Dyslexia is a condition that lasts for your life. The problems that you have learning to read and spell don't have to last for a life, though. We can overcome these. We can rewire the brain for reading so that a reading brain of a dyslexic person looks like a non-dyslexic person. But we'll say that that person is dyslexic, and there are gifts that come with dyslexia too. And they'll keep those gifts even though we rewire the brain for reading. And we know that dyslexia is genetic. It runs in families. One thing that I haven't mentioned before that I should is that dyslexia is a spectrum. So we can have kids that are very mild that we might not even identify. If we don't have proper systems in place, they might just fall through the crack. And there are people that are moderate and people that are severe. So it's not just, it's not just something that's either all or none. It's definitely a spectrum. Thank you so much for coming to lesson number 2.